Well, good morning. Good thing we had the challenges of the snow this week. I'm sure lots of families were excited at first and going nuts later, especially out here being off a whole week. That's my wife and I were trying to think of when was the last time that was, where you had a whole solid week like that off for the snow, at least as far as people related to school and kids. And it's been a long time. So it happens, but pretty rare. So that was good. So hope everyone's okay. Some of us took a few dives on the ice, but did okay. But that was a lot of snow. So, all right, it's been a couple weeks since we were here, and so I thought we would go back just a few slides on our topic here, because this concept is so important for what we're covering. And of course, as we're looking at what happened in the '60s and the social rights and civil rights and such that went on, it's important that we realize this aspect and recall what the social gospel was. And the social gospel was thinking that started in the late 19th century. And basically what the social gospel was in the minds of those that espoused that, was the application of the teachings of Jesus in the larger culture and the effect that it would have on that, rather than just what we've talked about as that privatized personal relationship with God, and that's what's most important, and that any doing things beyond that, you shouldn't be. And so the social gospel, that whole concept, I think originated is probably the wrong term, but Walter Rauschenbusch, and I think he was German, and he developed this, wrote about it, so on and so forth. And so it started gaining prominence, as we said, in the 19th century and into the early 20th. And so he said it's the old message of salvation, but enlarged and intensified. The individualistic gospel has taught us to see the sinfulness of every human heart, and has inspired us with faith in the willingness and power of God to save every soul that comes to him. But it has not given us an adequate understanding of the sinfulness of the social order and its share in the sins of everyone within it. And so the social gospel seeks to bring men under repentance for their collective sins. And so the idea was that instead of just individual things, that the structure, how can we change these things in society that are bringing about these ways and conditions and so on that are not good for mankind. And so that was kind of the thrust behind it, and that created a big conflict with that thinking. And so I don't know about you, but I know when I was growing up, the social gospel was kind of a bad phrase. It was looked at kind of negatively. It was viewed that hey, they don't really care about these truths that we see in the Scripture. They're just interested in changing these things. And so while there's some foundation to those criticisms, there's also some points to be made from what the social gospel was talking about. And so, for example, the food pantry that we have and work and support with, that's really comes from this thinking way back then. This was that ancestor of those kind of things that we take and think of are good and so on and so forth. Well, it had some of its roots in that. And so in this time period of the 20th century, and really up until the 60s, a lot of this, at least in our fellowship and in others, was kind of there were those that looked down upon it. And then there were those that looked positively about it. And so that's what we're seeing play out here. And so for Churches of Christ, that we're standing in that tradition of it's what you know, what you believe, do you believe the right things, and so on and so forth, that created some conflict. And so we mentioned Charles Shelton's book In His Steps, and that was where he's writing about this story about this preacher that challenges his congregation that don't do anything until you determine and think about what would Jesus do. And so the old bracelets that were a number of years ago and so on and so forth, it at least had its origins then. Whether there was manifestations of that since then and to more recently, I don't know. But that's where some of that came from. And so people would question and ask in their business practices and all kinds of things, what would they do? Because it was kind of like there was this life and then there's your spiritual life, that separation and compartmentalized in the minds of many. And so this is one that's saying, no, there's more to that. And so Austin McGarry, who we said started the Firm Foundation, well, he was one that was very much critical of this social gospel approach, and he said that, and we looked at even that he took some passages where there were in the Old Testament here in Amos, and they happened to mention instrumental music, and he tried to use that to say, look, God's against instrumental music also, kind of like throwing that in a pile of all these other things. And that is really what that's saying. As we said, the context of this was that, hey, you say you're my people, and you're putting on this big celebration, but you're completely missing out that you're not caring about people, you're not doing things right. And so that's what that criticism was. And so that leads us up that N.B. Hardeman, as we know, the famous preacher and teacher, Freed Hardeman, named after him. He started that college, and he was very huge in the early part of the 20th century in our fellowship. He illustrated this concept of the privatized gospel when he delivered a second series of tabernacle sermons in Nashville in 1923. As we mentioned, he had, I think there was 3 different times they had these giant gatherings at the Rhineman Auditorium, the old one in Nashville where the Grand Ole Opry was. And it was thousands and thousands and thousands heard him. It was like it would last a week or two, these things. And so in the one in 1923, he argued that in biblical times, people subsisted in dirt, filth, and thickly settled districts living in unsanitary surroundings. So he says, these were the conditions that they lived in. And so he came to the conclusion, and yet neither Paul nor any of his apostles were ever engaged primarily in the work of that sort. He concluded that the function and the work of the Church of God is not primarily for furnishing of temporal help or assistance, but the paramount work of the church is to spread the gospel. And so he's saying, wait, Paul didn't work to alleviate all that. And of course, others might read the scripture and say, well, are you reading carefully? Yeah, he didn't have big programs and this and that and so on and so forth. And so he's kind of looking at it through those eyes and coming to this conclusion, well, if Paul didn't care about that, then we shouldn't be caring about that. And all that's important is, do they believe in Christ? Do they understand the right things? Do they follow? And so that was kind of illustrates that. Speakers at the ACC, Abilene Christian College at the time, now university, Bible lectureship in the early years of the 20th century similarly rejected the social implications of the gospel. William Banowski, and he was going to be president of Pepperdine later on, explained in his book on the lectureships, the very weight of the lectureship lodged the standard conservative objection to the social gospel that the socially conscious liberals had forsaken the one great purpose of the church, namely the salvation of individual souls. And the speakers made virtually no reference to such questions as labor management, relations, capitalistic control, mass unemployment, breadlines, slum clearance, political reform, radical discrimination, or education for the handicapped and the underprivileged. In other words, here, and I'm assuming he's talking about a lectureship in the 60s. And so he's saying our lectureship isn't even touching on these giant societal issues that are so out there and, you know, on the TV every night and so on and so forth. And it says, and we didn't say anything about them, meaning talking about that particular lectureship. In other words, ignoring these large things that were happening in society. Banowski explained that when the lectureship speakers did express interest and support for orphans, widows, and the destitute, they almost invariably viewed these activities as a means to individual conversion or justified them on those grounds. In other words, well, if we have to do those, the whole purpose is we got to, you know, we got to be able to teach them the gospel. And while there's certainly truth in that, the idea of doing good, you know, to help. And so there were exceptions to this pattern in our fellowship throughout the 20th century. The Central Church of Christ in Nashville, which we've talked about previously, organized a massive program of outreach to destitute and homeless, as we have previously discussed, and that was in the 20s and 30s and 40s. They were kind of pioneering that. The Church of Christ in Madison, remember who was the preacher there? Ira North. You ever heard that? We've all probably heard that name, or many of us have. He was a very flamboyant guy. Carried out an active social ministry to orphans, the elderly, the homeless, and the destitute throughout the middle and later years of the 20th centuries, but these were the exceptions, not the majority. Now, as you recall, we talked about the battle over institutionalism, and that was the battles of should churches support orphanages and all these other things we talked about a few months ago. And so that's in the context of all this. This what's going on and trying to figure this out. This theological commitment to individualism and privatization of the gospel led many white evangelicals and most among our fellowship to reject the civil rights movement in the 20th century and even the 21st. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that people are wanting necessarily terrible or, you know, awful things, but I don't know if you recall, I know as a kid, I'm watching TV, just probably like you were, and what did we see going on? We saw all the clashes. We saw all the battles going on. And what was probably the response to that? I don't like, why are they doing that? Why are they acting up like that? Wow, if they're acting up like that, there must be something wrong with what they're trying to do. And of course, that's kind of how my household thought of it. And I'm not saying that's totally nuts, but nonetheless. And so it was kind of hard to grasp some of those things. Now, many black leaders among churches of Christ followed this line of opposition to the social gospel. But many others brought the protest tradition into a new era by embracing the civil rights movement. And so among our black congregations, there were many that thought just like we've been talking about, that privatization, that what does that have to do with it? And so there were those that did not support those actions. However, there were many that did. And Fred Gray, whose faith led him to the front lines of the legal battle to desegregate American society, became one of America's best-known lawyers. And we've mentioned him. And we've said in recent years our colleges have been honoring him for the work that he did. Andrew Harston explicitly connected the gospel with social activism when he wrote in 1964, "The race issue is no more social and to be divorced from the life and preaching of the true church today than it was when Christ died for the demolition of that wall separating man from man. And so here you see an understanding and a thinking that's saying, wait a minute, this is huge. This can't be dismissed. And saying this right or wrong needs to be made right. And so here's someone that theologically, Church of Christ thought down the line like, so many others did, and so on and so forth. And yet, he's looking at this from a very different perspective. Partly because it affects him. He's not getting the results of some of that. Floyd Rose was another figure who organized protests and economic boycotts from the pulpit. After Franklin Florence's congregation asked him to leave the pulpit in 1970 due to his activism, he started another congregation where he continued to practice socially concerned Christianity. In other words, there were those that saw that this involvement in trying to change these large meta problems as they saw it within our culture did that under believing that this is what the gospel is in action, in changing to make things better and more right. And so Norman Adamson urged in the Christian Echo, which we said was the publication that many of the black brothers and sisters read, in 1965, now is the time for us to let our white brothers who have bigoted and segregated hearts filled with hatred know that they stand condemned before God. Edward Robinson, who is a current scholar, and he's on the left there, was noted that most whites in the Stone Campbell movement failed to grasp the dire social and political circumstances of black Americans, compelled their preachers to reach beyond the pulpit to help people. And so here's where you see a major thing that's happening. In order to change these things, they weren't seeing support within the fellowship as a whole, and so they started looking outward to other things to change these great moral wrongs, if you will. And so it was challenging, and some felt very strongly. Now remember, Marshall Keeble probably felt just as strongly, or just as strong, but he went about it a different way, as we pointed out, and there was others that said, I want nothing to do with that. And so just two different approaches in trying to deal with things. Although many leaders, including progressives, who supported to some degree civil rights, rejected the social gospel. And so just like in anything, there's a spectrum. And where people are at and going to be, some go this far and others farther and no farther and so on and so forth. We see that happening here. Though there were some notable exceptions in social ministries. In 1963, for example, the Brookline Church of Christ in Brookline, Massachusetts, established an interracial urban ministry called House of the Carpenter. Okay, so they're up there in Massachusetts, and they're trying to do something to reach out to the poor and so on and so forth. Led by graduate students from Harvard, Boston University, and MIT, who were members of that congregation, the House of the Carpenter sponsored an after-school tutoring program, including Bible classes for neighborhood youth, a summer camp and special classes for neighborhood residents, offering training in a variety of fields, from sports to cooking. And this was one of the earliest forays in inner-city ministry among churches of Christ, and it thrived. And so why is this significant? Well, because it's one of the early ones, and that isn't what was happening a whole lot. And so, and of course, they received a lot of flack for it, but nonetheless. 1960s, 65, I think we said, 63. And then in 1967, the Boston Renewal Authority, government, raised the old storefront church that had been the home to the House of the Carpenter from its inception in order to make room for new high-rise buildings. So you have kind of the clearing out, the eminent domain, the old, we're not unfamiliar with that. undaunted, the Brookline Church of Christ purchased a new property that contained 6 classrooms, a library, recreation facilities, and office for staff and preachers. And the entire enterprise, however, came crashing down in the aftermath of the Grove Hall riot on June 3rd, 1967. And so here they are down in the city working. They've got a new property. They're trying to make it work. And yet they're in an area where some of those riots that took place, the protests and so on and so forth, and how they got. And so it kind of dissolved it, wore it out. And so here those were trying to do good, and yet the turmoil is destroying something that's trying to help, as we often see in things. Now, when Reuel Lemons, who was, of course, editor of the Firm Foundation, learned that the house of the carpenter he collapsed, he caustically wrote, "We can hardly stifle a yawn when some of our own radicals began to push for the social gospel through such projects as the House of the Carpenter, etc. Incidentally, we understand that the House of the Carpenter had been given up as an experiment that failed and closed down." And so, obviously, one not supporting it for some of those reasons that we said. And yet, he says, "We have no desire to say we told you so," even though he's telling us so. I always find that interesting. But when we pick up things, the denominations, the Salvation Army, and others have tried for years without results, we can expect them to fail. And so we see that bias, against others, that, that exclusivist view kind of coming out there. Like most others in the churches of Christ in those years, Lemons smelled liberalism in the church. Okay, in other words, they're saying, hey, what's going on? Slippery slope, so on and so forth. We've all heard those terms before. And so among those less concerned with soul saving than with helping downtrodden people. And so again, we see this tension going on between these two ideas. That do you care for people? Obviously, you want to try to teach them, and so the criticism is you're neglecting teaching the gospel, and you're dissatisfied with this, trying to make things better for them. Is basically what the argument is. And then, of course, the other way is you're not caring about people. You only care about have they thought the right thing, so that saves them, and then all this, well, that's just what it is. Kind of the heart of the argument. And so he hammered this theme again and again. Entirely too much of today's radicalism is aimed in one direction, only, i.e., the social gospel, he complained in 1969. The things many young Christians are pulling for make good fodder, but poor Bible. And so we see, how does one look at the scriptures and understand them? Now, it's interesting that certainly from our side of the track, so to speak, doing these things was always labeled liberalism. Now, liberalism is a very broad term. And so those that were trying to help were also lumped in, and often similar people, with those that were, rejecting the virgin birth and so on and so forth. So you had that aspect of it that we mentioned earlier last year. And so you get this, and so it all gets lumped together. And that may or may not have been the case. But nonetheless, we as people like to simplify things. We like to, say, well, if they're that, then they're all this, and so on and so forth. But anyhow, this is what's going on. And this was not unique. These were the times. This is that period of change, because frankly, for our fellowship, many others, we kind of look at that and we go, huh? Because we don't think that way now, or at least not to that degree. And so we see that there's always this period of time, and sometimes it's decades, of this transition in how we look at and how we think and understand things. 6 years later, in the aftermath of the turbulent 60s, H.A. Buster Dobbs provided a classic statement Now, Dobbs is someone that bought the firm foundation. He was a preacher from the very conservative wing of our fellowship, and he bought the firm foundation, I think in the 80s. And so this is after, I don't know if Rural Lemons had passed away or he was getting pretty old. And so that's who this figure is. And Dobbs provided a classic statement reflecting the dominant perspective in both mainstream and conservative churches on the issues of the social justice, if you want to call it that. The gospel of Jesus placed the emphasis on the individual. The social gospel puts the emphasis on the community. The gospel of Jesus teaches soul salvation. The gospel of Jesus encourages an emphasis on heaven and not on earth. The social gospel employs all its energy in worldly and not heavenly interests. And so whether one agrees with that or thinks that, that's how he's looking at it. And, you know, I would raise the question does it have to be either or? Just a thought. But nonetheless, and I'm not being critical here, because remember, it's always important that we try to understand. How many times we listen to the TV or what's going on in politics and we say, how can they think that way? What is wrong with their mind? What is their thinking? Well, there is thinking. We might not agree with it, but it's important that we try to understand it. And so, nonetheless, in this case, too. These examples provide a glimpse of the broader currents in American Christianity that significantly influenced our fellowship. Most white churches of Christ rejected social gospel for its perceived liberalism and that idea of the collectivist focus. Why? Because that smacks of communism, socialism and communism. And so, wow, if it's anywhere near there, we don't want to look at that. And the emphasis on social activism. Therefore, as Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movements emerged in the tradition of the social gospel, most white and some black members of our fellowship naturally distanced themselves from formal cooperation with the movement and its denominational leaders. Many of these people tended to focus on saving souls rather than combating racist laws as a key work of the gospel. Even black leaders were not inclined to view social problems and solutions between the individualistic lenses. And so again, complicated, a spectrum. You can't pigeonhole everybody on where they're at in this, because they're all in different places. The stage was set for the war between competing ideologies, the war between individualism with its privatization of the gospel and structuralism with a desire to redeem social structures had evolved from social gospel battles of the early 20th century to the civil rights battles of the 60s. The war saw continuing battles in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, suggesting that one of American Christianity's longest-running ideological wars has no clear end in sight. And we are experiencing much of this now. Maybe some different particulars, but others are feeling that some of these things are unresolved. And so this conflict of looking at it's this in our time. And so, well, it's important to understand. Now, desegregating colleges. One compelling gauge of the seriousness of the struggle that black members of the Church of Christ waged for equal treatment within the church and its institutions between 1955 and 1968 can be found in the efforts to desegregate Churches of Christ colleges. For many years, these colleges in the South simply reflected the racial attitudes of the region. In 1928, for example, the Abilene Christian College yearbook, The Prickly Pear, chose black minstrel characters for its volume's theme. Alongside degrading cartoons, there appeared derogatory racial language and demeaning stereotypes. It should be no surprise that ACC, along with every other white Church of Christ affiliated college except Pepperdine, refused to admit black students as a matter of stated policy. Now here, you can't see it well, but this was the prickly pear from, I think that says 1928, I was able to find. And here's, one of the things. Well, nowadays those things are just real offensive. Because and they probably should be, and it should be. But we're on this side of that. Then that was kind of what the norm was. If you like watching old movies, we all, probably most of us have seen White Christmas. Do you remember what the movie was before it was White Christmas? They had made it several years before Bing Crosby. It was called Holiday, was it Holiday Inn, I think. And in there, Bing Crosby is doing a minstrel act. And so this was in the 40s, meaning these things were prominent in the culture. And yeah. Having a what? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. No. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he kind of jabbed at everything, didn't he? Yeah. Well, no. But the point is that these attitudes and these things were here in our colleges. The U.S. Supreme Court handed down its landmark ruling Brown versus the Board of Education, which we've all heard of, in 1954. And where they declared segregation of America's public schools as unconstitutional. And that was Thurgood Marshall, I think. And I think they made a movie about that with Sidney Poitier a couple decades ago. It was really interesting. But and so how significant that was. Norman Rockwell has a very famous painting of a little black girl walking with armed policemen or so on and so forth that are taking her to school down in Little Rock because, they had all been, and so on and so forth. So, these things were so. But as late as 1960, okay, so here you are 6 years afterwards, as late as 1960, all Church of Christ colleges located in the South still refused to admit black students. The same held true for practically every other institution related in our fellowship. Herbert Locke is a brother who is assistant police commissioner in Detroit and minister of the predominantly black Connet Gardens Church of Christ, complained in 1965 the Church of Christ, for the most part, remained a religious symbol of all that is distasteful about the Southern way of life. He indicated their leading Southern educational institutions on the grounds that all but one refused to admit African Americans, Pepperdine. He went on to note that no black children have been admitted to church-related orphanages and no black residents to church-related homes for the aged. He concluded in saying, "We are the only major religious body in America whose voice has not been raised in the present conflict on the side of racial equality." And so this was the view that certainly our black brothers and sisters had about what was going on in the fellowship as a whole. And I think I mentioned this before. This is long, Ron may remember this. This was many years ago, and we were having an elders meeting in here, and I remember something John Burnett said. And he said this. He said, we have for years tried to reach out to our black congregations and felt that there was nothing not reciprocated back or something along those lines. And that always stuck with me. And of course, Lee was there, and we're talking about this, and didn't know why. Well, this was why. Because for some, it was so deeply ingrained and the hurt so great. Okay, you want to read? Okay, but it's not going farther than that. And that's kind of what it was. There was a brother at a congregation here down in the city, and I was talking to Lee about this, and Lee basically expressed that as to why this brother, even though it was cordial and friendly and all that, how things because this was what he had experienced. And so even though things change, the law changed, so what's wrong? What's the problem? Well, these deeply lingering experiences, you just don't get over those very quick. And so that's part of this. And that always stuck with me with John, that question of John. And so partly, when I was reading this several years ago, I just started crying. It was just like how, but it was. And again, I'm not trying to indict and all this, but it's just like sad. And yet that's what it is. And this is still with us for whatever reason, even though there may not be the attitudes and the strong emotional feelings and so on that once accompany this either direction. This is kind of what it is, and kind of sad. By 1960, black leaders who had rebuked racism within our churches for decades found an ally at Abilene Christian in Carl Spain. And a student, Everett Ferguson, and Everett Ferguson became a great scholar of early Christianity in our fellowship and respected all over. He wrote books like Early Christians Speak and so on and so forth. And I think he just passed away, but maybe he's still alive. But anyhow, this is when he was a student. Everett Ferguson had chastised the school for its segregationist policies in a 1953 chapel sermon, urging the school to desegregate even before the 1954 Supreme Court decision. But Spain rebuked the institution, and by implication, our whole fellowship at the college's 1960 annual Bible lectureship. Pointing to the slowness of our response to the issue of racial justice, Spain proclaimed, God forbid the churches of Christ and schools operated by Christians shall be the last stronghold of refuge for socially sick people who have Nazi illusions about the master race. In other words, confronting these racial understandings head on. Well, that was very significant. Somebody doing that. You didn't step out of place in that, and yet he did. Then he announced, "I feel certain that Jesus would say, 'Ye hypocrites, you say you are the only true Christians and make up the only true church and have the only Christian schools, yet you drive one of your own preachers to denominational schools where he can get credit for his work and refuse to take him or let him take Bible credit for your own or in your own school because the color of his skin is dark.'" And again, that was one of the things that our black preachers, a number of them, they could go to the Methodist University. They could go to some of these others, and they got their degrees, but they couldn't go to their own as far as our fellowships. And so that's what that's referring to. They were critics of Spain's speech, obviously, but the speech evoked such strong, broad-based support from the board, the administration, and the faculty, the students in the school's constituency, that Abilene Christian College began admitting black students to the graduate school in 1961 and to its undergraduate programs in 1962. According to John C. Stevens, assistant professor of the college in those years, the additional delay at the undergraduate level was not the reluctance to alter policy, but rather reflected an effort to avoid damaging the largely black Southwestern Christian College in Terrell, Texas, which at the time was only 12 years old and still struggling to attract students. So Southwest Christian, as we mentioned, is a black Church of Christ university. I think I don't know if it's the only one, and so that was started then. And so that's what that reference is. Now, interesting here, I hope I get this right, but Christiana Horn, her father was a very big supporter down at ACC back then. And she's told me a couple times about her dad, and her dad was very involved in these kind of things on probably the civil rights side, if you will. And he was a big lawyer, big Texas lawyer, and all this. And she said that when this happened, they wouldn't let him stay in the dorm. You get into school, but and that she said her father, who had some means, bought apartment complex is probably the wrong phrase, but and they stayed there. He bought that to help facilitate that. You'll have to have her when she comes again. Hopefully, we can have her kind of tell that story because she does it a whole lot better than I do. But nonetheless, and so we see these struggles as this change is coming about and happening. It didn't happen overnight, and have any of us ever said, "Well, the law changed, so what's the problem?" It's because there's a law doesn't mean anything. That could be for all kinds of stuff, good or bad. Now, R.N. Hogan, another black leader, praised Abilene for its actions, but continued to scold the other schools. It's almost an insult for a Negro to ask to be admitted to David Lipscomb College in Nashville. Yet it is supposed to be operated by Christians. What reason can Lipscomb, Harding, Freed-Hardeman, Florida Christian, and other schools who are refusing to allow Negroes to be trained in their schools give for such practice but sheer prejudice and hate? And so, they're really struggling with this. Hogan found it especially ironic that the school that bore Lipscomb's name was among the last bastions of segregation in our schools. By 1963, Harding College had integrated, and Lipscomb followed suit in 1964. So this is 10 years after the Supreme Court ruling. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Centerpieces on the table? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, Carl, yes. No, sure, and that's not an illegitimate position, but yeah,
If you're a sexual assault survivor or a survivor of physical assault, and you have a traumatic experience with watching MMA or boxing, is it my fault that I have the traumatic experience, or is it society's problem? And should we not be more reflective and understanding of, as the brethren are saying, if we're going to do an individual salvation, that individual's viewpoint should matter just as much. And we shouldn't have to change or say get over it. That's like telling a child who's crying because they hurt themselves, get over it.
yeah.
That's offensive.
It just depends on how they hurt themselves. If they've been
It doesn't
employed.
matter. If you have a 3-year-old child who hurts themselves.
Well, that's one thing. But if you
No,
have
but
an
it's not
older
one thing.
adult,
That's the thing. We categorize it and justify it because and we make excuses for it because it's a 3-year-old as opposed to an 18-year-old or a 55-year-old. But at the end of
day, and I'm annoyed by them because I think, people, grow up. I grew up in an environment that was very much like this, and I looked around and said, what in the world's going on here? Come on, folks, come together. You can't continue to just complain and complain. You got to get up every morning and accept God's renewal and move forward. Yes, I have been challenged in a lot of ways in my life, but I can't stand out on the street at 12 or 1 o'clock at night, burn down the neighborhood in hopes that that's going to improve something. I can't deal with that. That's not Christ-like.
Burning down the neighborhood is different than being offended.
Yeah.
Well, how much different is that than disrespecting an invitation to enjoy a moment in a good environment?
But if that environment is not good for the person who wants to enjoy it.
Well, then we have moments for talk.
Well, Carl,
Right.
Yeah.
And that's
Then we move forward. We try to move
But to
together
say
and
get
ask
over
what.
it is offensive in and of itself because you're presuming that they don't have a basis for their inability to accept for whatever reason.
We have a society where, as a Christian person, I have to be so cognizant of all the little details that are going on. I can't keep them all in my head.
But that's what Paul tells us. That's what Paul tells us is that we are to be the ones who forego our own pleasures to give those in community the right. So we are the ones who are supposed to take the burden. We are the ones who are supposed to take the oppression and move forward and accept it because the community will learn from us accepting the world and living in the world as those who tolerate the abuse, just like Christ tolerated the abuse of the world. He didn't go there and say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. He stood silent before Pilate, he stood silent before the Sanhedrin, and he took the punishment. And that is our goal as well. It is a difficult and heavy burden, and
Yes, it
almost
is.
impossible burden.
It is heavy
But
because
we are to say the world is always going to be wrong. We have to be better than the world and to accept that.
absolutely.
okay,
Absolutely.
Carl, we got time constraints.
Okay,
Sorry, but now I appreciate this
well,
dialogue.
I'm trying to
bec-
understand it.
Well,
I
no,
can't.
no,
It's so frustrating. To
and
have to bend over for everybody and their dog who has a big beef about, I can't do much about that. This stuff happened 150 years ago.
not all of it,
A lot of it.
some of it, but I think this illustrates the difficulty
Yeah.
that's involved and why, in societal wise, we continue to deal with this, even though probably many of us at times feel like you expressed, Carl. And then, but as our brother so articulately expressed over here, is that understanding. And if it happened to you, it's a lot harder to get over it than if it didn't.
Well,
And so,
Just one incident.
yeah,
When I was in Kansas City a few years ago, there was a house being rehabbed, sort of rehabbed. And there were folks from out of town
yeah,
that were in there working.
yeah,
And I talked to the guy
Yeah.
about how much, could I ask you how much the property went for? He told me it was nuts, pennies. Yeah, but I'm able to hire these guys from across the border and they work for nothing. And I thought, ooh, I got angry. I got angry with that guy. I said, you're gonna answer to that. Because if a man's worth his salt, he's worth paying.
yeah.
And
Well,
what was I supposed to do about that?
there's inequities everywhere.
But I
and
felt
all over.
sensitivity immediately.
Sure. Well, and so can others. I'm just saying, we just see how complex this is.
It is.
And especially when you get the emotional component in,
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Uh-oh.
Well, we're way over. And so thank you very much, and we will continue on next week. Thank you.